Card games have been around for a very long time, at least as early as the 9th century. But I know you aren't here for a history lesson, since this card game only really came into play in the 1970s to resolve an argument over a Crazy 8's rule. Today we'll be looking at Uno, and while there's a whole bunch of Uno games around today, I figured I would pick the one featuring anime characters and an actual story, since I'd seen a video making its rounds about what Uno would be as an anime card game, and remembered that this game existed. The game was released on both the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, with the latter being known as Uno DX, and all footage of this game will be from the PlayStation version running through a PlayStation 3. Please note that this game did not get an English release. The game is set in the fictional Japanese school of Itoku no Gakuen, and the game's story mode has you playing as Shunichi Uno, a first-year high school student as well as a member of the school's Uno club. Of course, having Uno in his name, Shunichi is very passionate about playing said card game, and seeks to participate in the National High School Uno Championship and to show people the joys of playing Uno. Throughout the game, Shunichi will visit areas around the school and play Uno with other students, and things aren't smooth sailing as the head of the disciplinary committee and the student council president have other plans. Outside of the story, you can play Uno with up to 5 other characters, or play in teams, with the winners scoring the most points overall. But is the game any good? Find out in The Good. I mean, at the end of the day, it's Uno, which is a reasonably fun card game. For those of you who aren't familiar with the rules, you and your opponents both begin with 7 cards, and you take turns playing cards that either match the colour, or the number or symbol at the top of the pile, until you run out of cards in your hand. If you don't have a card you can play, you can draw the top card of the deck, and if it's a playable card you can choose whether to play it or not. Once you or your opponent are down to 1 card, you'll need to call Uno, or risk being called out and having to draw 2 cards as a penalty. As well as numbers and colours, the game also adds cards such as Skip to skip an opponent's turn, Reverse to reverse the turn order, Draw 2 to have the next player draw 2 cards, Wild to name a colour of your choice, and Wild Draw 4, which allows you to name a colour as well as make the next player draw 4 cards. The Wild Draw 4, however, should only be played if you're unable to play a card that matches the colour of the top card of the pile. If a Wild Draw 4 is played, you can challenge or be challenged by a player to make sure the card was played legitimately. If it has been, the challenger has to draw 6 cards instead of 4 as a penalty, but if the challenge is successful, the player cannot use the card that turn and must draw 4 cards themselves as a penalty. The game also adopts the house rule of stacking draw cards, so you can counter an opponent playing a draw 2 against you by playing one right back and force them to either play another draw 2 to counter you, or draw 4 cards. The game also has Japanese and international rules, though I think that only affected the scoring, and most games can be settled by the winning player having more points at the end of a certain number of rounds. Another thing I did enjoy was how there's dialogue and little animations at play when you or your opponents play certain cards or call Uno. That was a pretty nice touch, and it does give that anime card game feel to it. Characters also change expressions if they have more than 12 cards in their hand, which really adds to the attention to detail. That's all I've really got here, so let's look at the things that weren't so good in The Bad. As with most card games, Uno requires you to have a strategy and luck on your side in order to win. I feel though that most of the opponents I've faced in Uno tend to have the deck stacked against you, if you excuse the pun. One opponent decided to start things off by pulling off a chain of skips, reverses and draw 2s, and being unable to counter them meant it would go straight back to my opponent's turn. Thankfully, there is a really satisfying feeling about turning the tides of battle and clawing your way to victory from the jaws of defeat, but it does get a little annoying when this starts happening to you much more often than not later in the game. Games can vary in length from a couple of minutes to over half an hour based on what cards you draw, and combined with some matches where you have to play up to 5 rounds against a single opponent. I feel this is more time consuming and was really just there to pad things out. The game does have you play multiple opponents, but doesn't take advantage of Team Uno, which I think could have benefited the story a little better, and perhaps add another dimension to it. Other than that, I really don't have any other complaints here, so let's wrap things up with the opinion. In the end, there isn't a great deal to talk about when it comes down to a game about Uno. The game does get the rules straight and even adds in that house rule, though to be fair, the stacking draw 2 and draw 4 rule not being an official Uno rule was finally clarified in a tweet from the official Uno Twitter account in 2019. The game does rely on luck, and I felt that there was some artificial difficulty as a result of perhaps giving your opponent the upper hand later in some games, but there wasn't anything outright bad. The game's story is fairly predictable and run-of-the-mill, where you have to save your club, and the music isn't much to write home about, but it exists to remind us that even a game like Uno can be an anime card game, and that this isn't the only version of Uno out there to have anime characters. It's just the one with a proper story. Nonetheless, if it's an Uno game with anime characters you want, then, well, here it is. So with that, it's time for my rating. I would give Uno for the PlayStation a blue reverse out of 10. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next Infinite Backlog review. If you enjoyed today's review, feel free to check out some of our other videos and subscribe for more. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram and our Facebook page. Once again, thank you for watching.